Good morning and welcome to Learn With Lorna. And before I do anything else, of course, just to apologise for the fact that I'm starting at 10 or 15 minutes late. Um, I suppose to have a technical fault for the first time after 32 weeks is probably not bad. But for some unknown reason, my camera completely crashed on my laptop and I had to restart. So my sincere apologies for being a little bit late. But thank you for joining me. And I'm particularly sorry for those of you in Australia. I know who are now going to have to be even later up to take part. But we're here. So hi, Penny. Thanks for saying hello. Please do say hello to me. As you can imagine, that's thrown my normal calm level of a Thursday morning. Um, so first of all, welcome to this Learn with Lorna series. If this is the first time you've joined me, then you're very, very welcome. A reminder that these talks are brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there is no payment or subscription required. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we would really very much appreciate that. So my name is Lorna Steele. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. As people will know if they have watched several of these, they'll be familiar with the fact that we have 4 offices across the Highlands. So we have the Highland Archive Centre in Inverness, the Lochaber Archive Centre in Fort William, the Skye and Loch Archive Centre in Portree, and the Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives up in Wick. You'll forgive me as well, I'm looking across from 2 screens here because, as I say, my camera going down has meant I'm seeing your comments coming in over here now, so you'll see me moving my head about a wee bit. So yes, we have the 4 offices, and this week we're going to look at a collection that's held in our Lochaber Archive Centre, and these are the papers of the West Highland Museum. So what I'm going to do is start by giving you a little bit of background to the West Highland Museum, who they are, what they do, what their collections are, and then how we come into that, their story and the collections and what those collections are that we look after for them. You'll be familiar, I'm sure, from other weeks, that in each of our offices we hold collections that relate to local institutions, businesses, from the Highland Health Board to Police Scotland, solicitors, shops, businesses, organisations, things like that. And one of those that we hold in our Lochaber Archive Centre is the papers of West Highland Museum. Sorry, I'm laughing because Stuart's saying that this delay just added to the anticipation of the talk. So one of the collections we hold in Lochaber are the papers of the West Highland Museum. Now, quite often an issue that we come across is that people maybe aren't familiar with what an archive is. Now, I know, of course, if you guys have been listening to me witter on for 32 weeks, you will know, but quite often people, they know what a museum is, they know what a library is, but they maybe not entirely sure what an archive is or what it does. And so I wanted to start by kind of clarifying very loosely what the distinctions are between those. We don't really take objects in an archive centre, we take original documents. Now, occasionally we take objects if they're integral to a collection. So for instance, if we had somebody's complete family papers, their military records, their military diaries, and there was a medal, then we would take that alongside it if it was integral to the collection. But generally, in an archive centre, we take original records of bodies, companies, organisations, individuals. A library tends to take published material, so obviously books, journals, things like that, which are published. And by and large, museums take objects. So quite often in Inverness, for instance, people will approach us with an object, then we will refer them to our colleagues either at Inverness Museum or wherever is the relevant local museum. That's a very basic definition, and there are overlapping areas, of course. And sometimes many museums have library and archive collections, and so what all of these institutions try to do is to keep the objects and the documents in the best possible conditions, so that each respective collection is looked after in the most appropriate way. And we often work together with museums. We often run joint events. We often support each other in all sorts of different ways. And one example of that is West Highland Museum, whose archive collections we look after. So as a museum, they have a reference library and they have an archive collection, but we look after their collections for them. So they remain in their ownership, but we house them in our temperature-controlled and archivally purpose-built storerooms. So a little bit about West Highland Museum, and I'm just saying, Eleanor, you joined for the first time and wondered why I wasn't there, so I am sorry. Normally I'm bang on 11. So West Highland Museum sits in the middle of Fort William in Cameron Square. It was founded in 1922, which makes it one of the oldest museums in the Highlands. And it has a very interesting start because it was founded by a group of local people, one of the key people being Victor Hodgson, who was one of the key organisers in this, and we have some letters from him in the collection. And what's interesting about the foundation of the West Highland Museum is that they had a vision for what they wanted. They wanted the West Highlands to have a museum of a very high quality, which told the story of the West Highland area. But they had no building to put it in, and they had no collection to start with. So that's obviously quite an unusual way to start a museum. And so what they did was they started with a series of summer exhibitions. So they asked people to give items in for temporary display, and then when they'd been lent, they would ask people to either lend them again, or if possible, to donate them to the museum collections. And that was how they started to build up a core collection. The focus, as was intended, was on the history of the local area, and they also, over time, started to gather a very important and prolific Jacobite collection. And that remains at the core of the West Highland Museum's collections today, the local history and a huge amount of very, very important Jacobite material. In 1926, there was a fundraising appeal, and the museum was able to purchase a building which had been a British Linen Bank building and turned it into their museum. And that's the building that they remain in today. So they've been there on Cameron Square since 1926. And they have a variety of items within their collection. As I say, they're looking to tell the story of the local area, and also, as has come about, the story of Jacobites and all sorts of other big subjects. So they have a lot of archaeological items. They have textiles and costumes, some very interesting and unusual tartan items, very early tartan items, arms and coins, a lot of material relating to the commandos, because the commandos during the Second World War trained in and around Lochaber. And again, we'll come back to that next week. I'm looking at World War II, so I'll touch on that next week. And as I say, they had a library section, a reference library section, and also they have an extensive archive collection. And that's where we come in, because those fantastic archive collections which belong to West Highland Museum have been deposited with us in Lochaber Archive Centre for safekeeping. Now, I'm referring to them as the archive collection of West Highland Museum, but actually there are around 30 individual collections within that larger body of collections. What I thought I would do was tell you about some of them. Don't fear, I'm not going to tell you in detail about 32 different collections, but what I thought I would do is just pull out some items from some of those different collections and tell you a little bit about them. And so I wanted to start by telling you about some of the estate collections within the West Highland Museum papers. I'm going to start with the Arasaig estate papers. So these date from 1817 up until the 1990s. If you've watched me previously, you'll know that family and estate collections are hugely diverse, but they often contain a mixture of estate papers to do with the running and management of the land and the things that go along with the land. So the resources, the fishing, the shootings, things like that. And also they often contain a section of personal papers that talk about the family who own the estate. And the Arasaig collection is one such collection. As with many estates, it passed through several hands and several families, but the collection mainly dates from when the Arasaig estate was in the hands of the Astley-Nicholson family and the Becher family. Within the estate papers, there are, I'm going to say the normal things, but what I mean by that is that they're quite common type of record, but of course they're all unique. There are legal documents within the Arasaig collection. There are leases for farms, for shootings. There are financial records, including wages books for staff who worked on the estate. And there are papers about the stock, the fishings, sheep on the estate, management of the land and resources, particulars of the shootings, a map, for instance, of the scale of the shooting, what the extent is of it, and what can be found on that land. And also within the estate correspondence, there can be found items relating to the church and other big organisations, because as we've talked about in previous weeks, most of the landowners or the heritors would have been heavily involved in the management of things like education, of roads development, of churches, things like that. Those people who are influential in those conversations appear throughout different record types. And then within this collection, there are personal papers. There are some fantastic journals and diaries. So there is a diary of an 1846 sailing to Iceland, quite unusual. Correspondence includes letters from Crimea during the Crimean War, so 1855, and telegrams from the Boer War. So there's telegrams regarding the relief of Kimberley in 1900. There are historical notes which include all lists of all the doctors who have been in Arisaig from the 1600s onwards. And there are genealogical charts of both the Astley-Nicholson family, both the Nicholson family and the Astley family, who obviously came together to form the Astley-Nicholsons. I'm just seeing, Charlotte, that you were born and brought up on Arisaig Estate. These records, as I'll come and touch on in a second, the research uses for them are just extraordinary. You know, you can use them to research something as big and diverse and important as the Jacobites, or you can use these estate records to find out about a family member who worked on an estate. So really fantastic resources. Now, I mentioned that there are journals and diaries within this collection. And again, if you've listened to me before, you'll know I'm a big fan of a diary and a scrapbook, partly because those are people's own thoughts and opinions. They're written down not for an audience. They're written down as a personal expression of something. But the other reason I love them is that often they're accompanied by other things, and these ones within this collection are a good example of that. They are accompanied by photographs stuck in, or poems, or songs, or sketches. They're references to local events. So these scrapbooks and journals have adverts stuck in for what's happening in the local area. So all sorts of things. There are journals of trips, world trips to New Zealand in the 1890s, which include photographs of people, of Maoris, of scenery. So really quite an unusual thing. This collection also contains some fantastic correspondence from Jenny Lind, who was a singer known as the Swedish Nightingale, as I'm sure many of you will know, and from the poet Robert Browning, who was, of course, married to Elizabeth Barrett Browning. So all sorts of different subjects and different types of life experience to be found within this collection. There are photos from the 1930s of the Middle East, pictures of people, of scenery, of buildings, of transport types in the Middle East in the 1930s. And that's why I say that the research uses for a collection like this are really quite extraordinary. I wanted to tell you a little bit more about a couple of other estate collections. One very small, but I wanted to mention for a specific reason, is the Inverlochy estate. It's a much, much smaller collection. There's only a few things in it. But the reason I mention it is that it includes accounts by collectors of rents on the estate through the 1840s and 1850s. And so again, this is the estate of Inverlochy. Again, if your family has come from that area, it may well be that you may find a reference to them within those rent books. And that was why I wanted to just quickly highlight that small collection. And then I wanted to talk about two further family and estate collections from within this wider West Highland Museum collection before I go on to talk about some of the other things within it. The Lochgarry papers. These were created by the Macdonells or the MacDonalds of Lochgarry. They are generally called the Macdonells, but the name can be interchangeable. This collection dates from 1715 through to 1928. So a good 200 years of Lochaber history. This family were involved in the Jacobite Risings, and if you're not familiar with the ins and outs of the Jacobite Risings, then I did a previous talk on this about the Jacobites. If you would like to know more and understand more about how those risings came about and how they absolutely affected life in Scotland and the wider UK, then please do have a look at that. This family, the MacDonnells of Lochaber, were involved in the Jacobite Risings, and as a result of this, their estate was forfeited in 1747 after the Battle of Culloden, when the Jacobite cause had all but collapsed largely. Their estate was forfeited because they had taken part in the Jacobite side of the Risings. But later, family members went on to join the British Army, and therefore the estate came back into the family, was restored in about 1784. So you can see the influence of national and international politics on one family in Lochaber through a collection like this. Similar to the Arisaig collection, this family were involved with in travel, visited a lot of other places. One of the MacDonnells of Lochaber, Alexander, who was the fourth of Lochaber, held office in the palace of the King of Portugal, and he went on to become a Portuguese subject. And so there's correspondence in the collection between family members there. Some are written in Portuguese, and included in that is his naturalisation certificate of becoming a naturalised citizen of Portugal, and this is in the late 1700s. His son went on to fight at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, and his son, so Alexander's grandson, served in the Indian Army. So again, it's another example of a local Lochaber-based family with a huge interest to Lochaber and the wider Highlands, but such a global reach of the family and what they had been involved in is quite extraordinary. So the collection includes all sorts of correspondence from the first Lochaber through to the seventh. There are legal papers in there regarding the forfeiture of the estate, so there are reports on the estate being forfeited and on the estate coming back into the family. So a really good insight into the practicalities of how that forfeiture happened and how it affected the family in the area. As I say, there are legal papers. There always are in an estate collection, because that's what's controlling the governance of the estate and the resources. And one thing I wanted to just quickly point out from within this collection is it's a saceen, so it's a land transfer document in favour of Duncan MacBain, Esquire of Tomatin, and it's connected to the estate of Lochaber. Now, the reason I bring that, it's just one document within that collection, but the reason I'm highlighting it is that within the Highland Archive and Registration Centre in Inverness, we hold the MacBain of Tomatin records, and it's just another example of how those collections link in across and between our four offices, the Highland Archive Service 4 offices, between us and all the museums who exist, both within High Life Highland and out with High Life Highland, who are the independent museums across the Highlands. We are able to link and build a really excellent picture of life in the Highlands. And we're so fortunate to have so many museums, archive collections, and interested and knowledgeable individuals as well, that we can link all these things together and tell the story across our collections. Finally, I just wanted to touch a little bit on one last estate collection before I move on to some other records within the West Highland Museum papers. If you remember a few weeks ago, she says, I can't remember when it was now, but a few weeks ago I did the Cameron of Lochiel collection, which is also held in our Lochaber Archive Centre. So you maybe remember me speaking about the Camerons and that branch, the main line of the Camerons, the Cameron of Lochiel. We also have the Cameron of Fassifern collection. That's part of the West Highland Museum papers held in Lochaber Archive Centre. And the Cameron of Fassifern are a cadet branch of the Clan Camerons, so they're not the main line, but they're a line coming off the side from one of the sons. And we have the papers of Sir Ewan Cameron of Fassifern, who was alive from 1740 until 1828, and he had inherited the Fassifern estate from his father in 1785. And he became the factor of the Lochiel estates. So you can see how he continued to work alongside. Of course, they were close relatives. He was a nephew of Cameron of Lochiel at that time. And so the families continue, of course, to be closely interlinked. It has, but this collection has some financial records in it and some correspondence. But again, really the reason I highlight it is to show those interlinks. So the Cameron of Fassifern collection and the Cameron of Lochiel collection have come to us through different routes, but they interlink and they tell a wider story, and you can get both sides of a story when you look wider than one collection. Before I go any further, just a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer, and that High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in these events, but we would welcome donations if you're in a position to do so. Other collections, so I've started talking about the estate papers within the West Highland, and as I say, this is a very, very small section of what I could talk about in the West Highland Museum papers, because there are so many fantastic things within there. But I wanted to start by talking about estate papers and then move on for the second half to look at some other of the collections within there. As I've said, we hold papers from all sorts of different institutions and organisations, and these can be seen within the West Highland Museum papers as well. So we hold within this collection the papers of the Ben Nevis Observatory and Hotel. Now, I'm not going to say really any more about that because I'm looking to do a talk on landmarks and landscapes in at the beginning of next year, and that will focus on Ben Nevis. So I'm not going to talk any more about that other than to draw your attention to the fact that we hold that collection and that it includes visitor books of people who stayed in the hotel at the summit of Ben Nevis. There's also the papers of the Fort William Bowling and Recreation Company, and those date from 1898 onwards, minute books and correspondence about recreation and leisure in Fort William. Also to do with recreation and leisure, the Fort William Literary Society minute books, and the papers of the Fort William Tourist Board, which later became part of the Highlands and Islands Development Board, whose collection we hold in Inverness, and eventually became part of the Highlands section of the Scottish Tourist Board. And those records for the Tourist Board date from the 1950s to the 1990s, and they give an insight into the development of Lochaber and Fort William as a tourist destination. They give insights into development of skiing in the area, setting up of skiing resorts, visitor centres, discussions around the development of the waterfront, hotels, everything from public toilets to bins. And I highlight that one again just to show that the complete diversity, you know, within the West Highland Museum papers, you could look at the history of one family. You could look at a family member who served within who worked within an estate. You could look at somebody's involvement in a military section. You could look at the development of 1960s tourism in Fort William. Such a wide range of subjects. But finally, I wanted to talk about what is perhaps one of the biggest subsections of the West Highland Museum papers, and certainly is one that I tend to use very frequently, and that is the section called Collected Scottish and Jacobite Papers. This is an extensive collection of papers relating to one of West Highland Museum's strongest subjects, the Jacobite uprisings. And as I say, if you're not familiar with that, please do go and have a look at the talk that I did on Jacobites. It will give a little bit of background to that. These papers talk about Jacobitism, but also about the general history of Scotland, and they date from 1578 through to 1935, so a really wide date range. And as you can imagine, that kind of date range covers all sorts of things that happened within Scottish history. So for instance, there are papers within there relating to the border reivers. They date from 1585, I think. I'm just going to check that. 1583, I think. That's the absolute height of the Scottish border warfare with the English border warfare. So that's an insight into something that's happening far away from here, but had a relevance to the people living in Lochaber, and they're involved in it, they're aware of it, they're discussing what's happening there. There's a 1639 letter by the 8th Earl of Argyll, which talks about the trouble being caused by the broken men of the Highlands, which I think is a particularly, I'm going to say beautiful, but you know what I mean, it's a particularly eloquent description, the broken men of the Highlands causing trouble. One I may have mentioned before is 1654 letter written from the governor of the fort of Inverlochy, written direct to Oliver Cromwell. That just blows my mind, which I may have mentioned before. I just find that absolutely extraordinary that I have had my hand on a letter written to Oliver Cromwell. He's asking for supplies, by the way. He's saying that we need supplies and we won't be able to get to London to get them, so you need to get them to us. Around about 1680s, late 1680s, 88, 89, was the start, really, of the Jacobite risings. And there are a lot of letters within this collection that talk about that, requesting that clan chiefs raise troops, requesting that people gather their clan members to fight. Again, something I've said before, but it strikes me as absolutely extraordinary that we have the contemporary backwards and forwards discussion around something which turned out to be such a huge turning point in Scottish and British history. And we have those letters of someone saying, I want you to raise troops for this. Some writing back saying, I don't know if I'll make it in time. Someone saying, oh, well, you must be there. So it's just a contemporary discussion of something so substantial. There are lists of prisoners within this collection. Prisoners taken in 1715 in Leith, in Prestonpans, in Stirling. There's a signed letter by King James VIII, as he called himself. He never actually was King James VIII, but he would be seen to be the rightful heir by those supporting the Jacobite cause. There is a facsimile of the order that led to the massacre of Glencoe within this collection. And I wanted to read to you one document, which is the orders from Bonnie Prince Charlie ordering the people to march south, his supporters to march south and gather support in England. And I wanted to read that to you because it's quite stirring as a military instruction. So it says, you are hereby authorised and directed to repair forthwith to England, and there notify to my friends, and particularly those in the north and northwest, the wonderful success with which it has hitherto pleased God to favour my endeavours for their deliverance. You are to let them know that it is my full intention in a few days to move towards them, and that they will be inexcusable before God and man if they do not do all in their power to assist and support me in such an undertaking. What I demand and expect is that as many of them as can should be ready to join me, and that they should take care to provide provisions and money that the country may suffer as little as possible by the march of my troops. Let them know that there is no more time for deliberation. Now or never is the word. I am resolved to conquer or perish. If this last should happen, let them judge what their and their prosperity have to expect. I think that's such a striking, there's no more time for deliberation, it's now or never, and I will conquer or I will perish. And if I perish and you haven't helped me, how do you think you're going to be judged in the future? As we know, the Battle of Culloden failed from a Jacobite perspective, and another letter within this collection dates from 1746, and it is advising MacDonald of Kingsborough to give up Bonnie Prince Charlie if he appears. So it's an instruction saying if Bonnie Prince Charlie appears, then you have to hold him and you have to give him up to the authorities. As you can imagine, if you have come to know me at all through this series of talks, this has been a nightmare trying to pick which ones to reference to you, because as I say, there are about 32 collections within the West Highland Museum collection, and amongst all of those are things I could have picked out and could have read and could have focused on, but I thought that one was particularly striking. The last thing I wanted to tell you about within this collection before I go on to a final reading, you'll be glad to hear, are the papers of Mary McKellar. And these, she was called the Lochaber Poetess, and there are letters and correspondence to and from her, including a letter from Queen Victoria thanking her for the poetry book that she had sent. So just going from that letter from Bonnie Prince Charlie to the Poetess of Lochaber shows you the extent and range of the items within this. But I wanted to round off by reading you one last thing. This is a letter, again, a very short abstract little paragraph of a letter, and you have maybe seen it because it was the picture I used to advertise this event. And this was written by Bonnie Prince Charlie, again, at the time he was Prince Regent, to Ewan Macpherson of Cluny. And it was written on the 6th of August, 1745. And again, an absolutely pivotal moment in Scottish history, and something that has come to define the image of Scotland and the image of the Highlands. Next year will mark the 275th anniversary of the Battle of Culloden, so keep an eye out for that. We will be doing something to mark that. But when we put this post up, we put a post up with this image on Facebook to mark the anniversary, and it went absolutely viral. It went all around the world, all sorts of people being caught up in the emotion of this particular document that I'm going to read to you. So I wanted to share it to round off. It's written from Borrowdale, August the 6th, 1745. Being fully persuaded of your loyalty and zeal for the King's service, I think fit to inform you that I am come into this country to assert the King's right, at the head of such of his faithful subjects as will engage in his quarrel. I intend therefore to set up the royal standard at Glenfinnan on Monday the 19th inst. Your appearance on that occasion would be very useful, but if not practicable, I expect you to join me as soon as possible, and you shall always find me ready to give you marks of my friendship. And it's signed Charles P.R. for Prince Regent. And if anyone, any of you are familiar with your Jacobite history, you'll know that the standard was indeed raised at Glenfinnan on the 19th of August, 1745, to start the 45 uprising. I think I've mentioned on previous occasions, I know I talk a lot with some passion about the Jacobites. Now, I don't have any particular feeling one way or the other for the cause. But what I do have a very strong feeling of is just an excitement and delight that these documents exist, and a sense of huge privilege that I am able to handle them and work with them and share them with you. And I hope, if nothing else, I hope you've gained through these talks a real insight into how much these collections matter to us. Those of us who work with historical collections, whether that's in archives or museums, are very, very aware of the privilege that it is to handle these objects and documents, and we don't take that lightly, and it really is a privilege to share them with you as well. And as I say, that's a very kind of brief overview of the West Highland Museum papers, which I could have gone into more because there are so many fascinating things within there. I hope you've seen that they have a range of uses, from family history to local history to international history. All sorts of things can be found within there. If you'd like to know more about the West Highland Museum collections, whether that's archival or museum collections, then please do contact either ourselves at Lochaber Archive Centre or West Highland Museum themselves. We would all be delighted to hear from you. I can say that quite confidently on all our behalf. Do have a look at West Highland Museum's website and social media pages to find out more about their collections. I hope you can join me next week. I'll be looking at further stories from World War II. I will be absolutely sure to have the camera working, although I have to say I don't know why it didn't, but I will be on time at 11 o'clock. Yes, so next week we'll be looking at World War II to tie in with Remembrance Sunday. I've scheduled in all the talks now till the end of the year, so please do have a look. And I hope you can join us for some of those. If you want to follow us, that would be great, but don't feel that you have to. But yeah, I hope you can join us for the talks running up to Christmas. I'm particularly looking forward to doing Christmas in the collections. And thank you as well to the person who expressed concern for me never getting a day off. That made me laugh quite a lot. Someone had commented the Christmas and Hogmanay, Christmas Eve and Hogmanay talks look great, but I'm very concerned that you never get a day off. I do sometimes. Thank you for joining me. Again, apologies for being a little bit late. And a reminder that these talks are brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in these events. So I hope you can join me next week. If not, I hope you can catch up with some of the talks on YouTube subsequently. Thanks again.